Behind the almost virtuous shine of perfectionism lies a fear as deep as it is poorly understood, the fear of one's own power. Many believe that being a perfectionist is a sign of discipline, commitment to excellence, or even a high moral standard. Society, after all, tends to applaud those who accept nothing less than the best. But what if all of this is just an illusion? What if, behind this relentless pursuit of perfection, there is not a strength, but a weakness, an unconscious strategy to avoid facing something much more frightening, the true potential that each individual carries within themselves? For Carl Gustav Jung, perfectionism is not necessarily a virtue. In the view of the Swiss psychiatrist, it can be a sophisticated mechanism of self-sabotage. The human mind, Jung says, creates masks, the so-called personas, to hide parts of the self that it fears to expose to the world. And, in many cases, perfectionism is precisely that mask. An impeccable facade that protects the individual not only from external judgment, but above all, from the terror of having to take responsibility for their own greatness. Imagine someone who dreams of writing a book, launching a business, changing careers, or even speaking in public. This person spends years studying, planning, adjusting every detail. But they never start. They never take the first step. Because there is always something that isn't good enough yet. The text isn't perfect. The plan isn't solid. The idea still needs adjustments. And so the days, months, and years go by. In this case, perfectionism is not about quality. It is about fear. Fear of failure, of course, but even deeper, fear of success. Because, as Jung observed, success brings with it a painful revelation that one could have done much more, much earlier. Perfectionism creates a state of elegant paralysis. The individual does not move, but seems busy. They are always working on something, always improving a detail. And in the meantime, they avoid facing the most dangerous question of all. What am I really capable of? For the answer to that question is not only grand, it is also frightening. Discovering one's own power also means having to look at lost time, wasted opportunities, and the responsibility that comes with one's own strength. Jung asserted that the shadow, the unconscious part of the psyche where desires, fears, and repressed potentials reside, often includes precisely this unrecognized greatness. And when someone keeps it hidden, they create acceptable justifications for not launching themselves into the world. Perfectionism is one of the most socially valued traits. It is much more acceptable to say, "I haven't started because I want it to be perfect," than to admit, "I haven't started because I'm afraid of what I might become." In this video, this thesis will be explored in depth. The idea that perfectionism is not a noble trait, but a disguised way of staying small, protected, and above all, away from the pain of embracing one's own power. It will be a journey through Jung's thoughts, the labyrinths of the shadow, and the unconscious mechanisms that keep millions of people stagnant, even though they seem to be striving harder than anyone else. And, above all, it will be an invitation to question a dangerous belief, that perfection is the path to freedom, when, in fact, it may be the most beautiful of prisons. Because in the end, perhaps the question is not, why do you want to be perfect? But rather, what are you avoiding discovering about who you really are? Perfectionism, under the clinical and almost surgical gaze of Carl Gustav Jung, is not merely a mania for details, nor is it an elevated quality that distinguishes the best from the average. From a Jungian perspective, it is a deeply rooted psychic mechanism that serves a very specific function: to protect the ego from confronting internal contents that it is not prepared to integrate. And among these contents is often the individual's own inner power. Jung observed that human beings live in constant tension between what is conscious and what remains unconscious. Perfectionism fits precisely into this liminal territory, between the conscious that desires admiration and the unconscious that fears exposure. The obsession with doing everything impeccably right is often a plausible excuse to avoid concrete action, for while one is perfecting something, one is not taking real risks. But there is something even deeper in this process. Perfectionism feeds on the persona, the social mask that each person constructs to present themselves to the world. This mask seeks acceptance, approval, recognition. For the perfectionist, the persona becomes almost an altar, a sacred place where everything must shine without blemishes. They need the world to see them as meticulous, dedicated, and demanding of themselves. This irreproachable public image functions as a shield, and behind this shield lies what Jung called the shadow. The shadow is not merely a repository of vices, traumas, or shameful memories. Jung went further, asserting that the shadow also contains talents, desires, creative impulses, and above all, the individual's potential. Everything that has been repressed, not for being bad, but for being too great for the current structure of the ego to bear. That is why many perfectionists, deep down, are not just fleeing from making mistakes. They are fleeing from succeeding so overwhelmingly that their lives would need to change completely. Think of someone who dreams of starting their own business. To the world, this person says they are not ready yet, that they need to study more, plan better, save more money, learn about marketing, understand people management. The discourse is perfect, socially admirable, but in reality, there may be a visceral fear behind it. Fear of success. Fear of having to deal with greater responsibilities, with others' expectations, with being observed and judged under a new light. Perfectionism is the perfect alibi. It prevents falling, but it also prevents flying. Jung understood that the human psyche cannot tolerate vacuums. When the individual does not act in the world, the psychic energy that should be used to create, achieve, and transform turns inward, where it transforms into anxiety, self-criticism, existential crises. That is why often, the more perfectionist someone becomes, the more anxious, dissatisfied, and frustrated they feel. The psyche demands expression, and perfectionism is a gilded prison that blocks that expression. Therefore, pursuing perfection is not just about wanting to do things well. It is often a sophisticated maneuver of the unconscious to avoid the deep discomfort of confronting one's own potential. Because those who recognize their own power can no longer hide. They must use it. And that means exposing oneself, taking risks, dealing with failure, but also with success, which for many is even more terrifying. But if perfectionism is in fact a disguise for the fear of one's own power, what exactly is this power that is so frightening? What is so devastating about recognizing our own greatness? This is precisely what we will discuss in the next part. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Speaking of fear of one's own power may sound strange at first glance. After all, who in their right mind would be afraid of being powerful? Isn't that what everyone says they want? To be strong, successful, capable of transforming their lives and the world around them. But Carl Gustav Jung compels us to look beyond the obvious answers. For him, the fear of one's own power is not only real, it is one of the deepest and most paralyzing fears of human beings. This fear arises because true personal power is not just a source of fulfillment, it also carries an immense burden of responsibility. Recognizing who one truly is implies accepting that one could have done more, gone further, created or achieved extraordinary things. And this realization is psychologically devastating for many. For in admitting one's own power, a person must also confront the time wasted, the missed opportunities, the dreams postponed under the excuse of lack of perfection. Jung said that there is a significant difference between what the ego consciously desires and what the self, the deepest core of the psyche, demands from us. The self calls us to realize our individuation, to develop our fullest uniqueness. But this call is uncomfortable, sometimes painful, because it forces us to step out of our comfort zone, to abandon fragile and limited identities, and to face the unknown that exists both within and outside of us. That is why, for many people, it is safer to remain small. Living below one's potential offers comfort, anonymity, and less exposure. Being excellent requires courage not only to face external challenges, but above all, to deal with the gaze of others and the relentless judgment that often accompanies those who dare to shine. Because society, even if it claims to value genius, often punishes those who stand out too much. Those who appear too great become targets of envy, suffocating expectations, or even hostility. Furthermore, there is the weight of one's own shadow. Jung stated that everything we repress, including our greatness, ends up in the shadow. And what remains in the shadow begins to exert unconscious influence over us. A person may, without realizing it, create situations where they sabotage their own projects, destroy promising relationships, or give up at the decisive moment, all to avoid having to bear the weight of becoming who they could truly be. Because realizing one's power implies having to live up to it. And that is a gigantic demand. The fear of one's own power is also linked to something that Jung saw clearly: the paradoxical nature of human beings. Within each individual exists both the desire for freedom and the fear of that freedom. The desire for greatness coexists alongside the desire to remain protected, hidden, out of the risk of failing, or of triumphing. Because triumph is also frightening. For once someone recognizes what they are capable of, they can no longer claim ignorance. There are no more excuses for inertia. The call of the self becomes deafening. And it is precisely here that perfectionism plays its role. It becomes the trench where the individual hides to avoid responding to the inner call. As long as they are busy seeking the perfect moment, the perfect plan, the perfect text, they can avoid the anguish of dealing with their own creative strength. Perfection is, therefore, the most acceptable alibi for remaining small. But if all of this is hidden in the depths of the psyche, where exactly does this feared strength reside? Where is this power that, according to Jung, inhabits our shadow and can, at the same time, destroy or liberate us? To answer this question, we need to enter the darkest territory of the human mind, the shadow. And it is precisely about this that we will talk in the next part. To understand why so many perfectionists remain trapped in endless cycles of idealization and immobility, one must delve into one of the most fascinating and disturbing concepts of Carl Gustav Jung's analytical psychology, the shadow. And when talking about the perfectionist's shadow, it is not just about flaws, vices, or ugly thoughts. It is primarily about repressed potential, hidden desires, and fears so deep that they often do not even reach consciousness. Jung defined the shadow as everything that the individual does not wish to be, but that nonetheless is. These are aspects, qualities, impulses, abilities, and feelings that have been banished from consciousness because they did not fit the socially acceptable image, the persona, that each person has constructed for themselves. In the case of the perfectionist, the persona is impeccable. Someone disciplined, detail-oriented, always in pursuit of excellence. But behind this facade, the shadow may contain precisely the opposite: fear, insecurity, anger, envy, and, ironically, also grand talents that have been repressed for seeming excessive or threatening. For Jung, repressing the shadow does not make it disappear. On the contrary, everything that is denied and banished to the unconscious becomes even more powerful, exerting a silent influence over thoughts, behaviors, and decisions. Perfectionism can then be seen as a highly sophisticated defense mechanism. By maintaining an obsessive focus on details, the individual keeps the shadow locked away, preventing its contents from surfacing and forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. This is where the paradox arises. The perfectionist believes they are in control, that they are working hard to achieve the best possible outcome. But in reality, they are controlled by the fear that resides in their shadow, controlled by the anxiety of exposing themselves, of being criticized, of shining too brightly, or of failing spectacularly. It is as if perfectionism were a protective wall, only, at the same time, this wall also becomes a prison. Within the perfectionist's shadow dwell not only the flaws they fear to show, but also their greatness. Many do not realize that the greater fear is not of making mistakes, but of hitting the mark perfectly, because realizing one's potential means launching oneself into the world without shields. It means dealing with envy, the weight of expectations, and the need to maintain results. And above all, it means having to acknowledge that all the time spent hiding was, in part, a precious waste. Jung believed that there is immense life force in the shadow. Everything we repress, including our talents, creativity, and boldness, remains there, accumulating energy. This energy, not finding a healthy outlet for expression, begins to manifest dysfunctionally. Chronic anxiety, panic attacks, compulsions, extreme procrastination. That is why many perfectionists live in a permanent state of tension. They carry within them a dormant volcano, ready to erupt. And there is something even more unsettling. The shadow does not only reveal itself in moments of crisis. It infiltrates the small choices of daily life. In an email that takes hours to write because it is never good enough. In a project that is never launched. In a relationship that ends before it even begins, out of fear of not being perfect in the eyes of the other. The shadow silently sabotages every step, while the perfectionist maintains the illusion of merely waiting for the right moment. Deep down, perfectionism is an unconscious strategy to avoid contact with this shadow. For facing it means admitting hard truths, that the person is hiding from their own potential, that fear paralyzes them more than any imperfection ever could, and that as long as perfectionism seems noble, no one will force them to change. But there is an immense cost to keeping the shadow locked away, and this cost manifests in very concrete ways in the emotional, professional, and existential life of the perfectionist. What are these consequences? What happens when someone lives enslaved by this dynamic? This is what we will explore in the next part. Perfectionism, seen from the outside, seems like a virtue. Many associate it with the pursuit of excellence, dedication, and commitment to impeccable results. But those who live within this armor know that the psychological cost is devastating. For Carl Gustav Jung, everything that is kept repressed or not lived comes at a price. In the case of the perfectionist, the cost often manifests as anxiety, guilt, paralysis, and a chronically dissatisfied life, despite often appearing successful in the eyes of the world. One of the greatest traps of perfectionism is the constant illusion of being almost ready. The individual is always one step away from starting, launching, exposing themselves, but never gets there. This eternal wait for the perfect moment drains vital energy. Jung called this psychic stagnation, the energy that should be used for action, creation, and transformation gets trapped in an internal whirlpool, spinning without finding an exit. That's why many perfectionists live exhausted, even when they seem to be doing nothing concrete. There is also the deep suffering caused by relentless self-criticism. The perfectionist not only seeks to do everything impeccably, they torment themselves for every minimal, real, or imagined failure. Small mistakes turn into internal catastrophes, eroding self-esteem. Jung warned that the ego, when hypertrophied and overly identified with the persona, this perfect social image, cannot tolerate imperfections because each failure threatens the identity built with so much effort. The result is an individual who lives in constant fear of being unmasked, as if at any moment everyone would discover that they are not as competent, intelligent, or disciplined as they seem. But perhaps the highest cost of perfectionism is existential. Jung said that living below one's potential inevitably generates suffering. The perfectionist may even gain external recognition, but often carries a sense of emptiness. They feel they are always behind what they could have been. The problem is that admitting this would mean accepting that years, sometimes decades, have been wasted in the name of an impossible ideal. And this awareness is so painful that many prefer to remain in the cycle of eternal improvement, even knowing on some level that they are sabotaging themselves. Another devastating consequence of perfectionism is the toxic relationship with failure. The perfectionist does not see mistakes as learning opportunities, but as proof of inadequacy. Each failure is experienced as a mortal blow to their identity. This generates paralyzing fear. After all, if everything must be perfect, any misstep is unacceptable. This mindset hinders not only personal growth, but also creativity. For innovating means experimenting, taking risks, and accepting that many attempts will be imperfect. There is also the impact on relationships. The perfectionist is not only demanding of themselves, but often projects their high expectations onto others. Partners, co-workers, friends, everyone ends up being measured by the yardstick of perfection. This creates distance, conflicts, and a chronic feeling of loneliness. Because deep down, no one can meet such rigid standards, not even the perfectionists themselves. In the book, The Undiscovered Self, Jung warns that the modern individual, by losing contact with their true self, becomes vulnerable to external pressures and ends up living according to others' expectations. The perfectionist is a living example of this. They are so busy trying to maintain the impeccable mask that they disconnect from who they really are. And in this process, they become increasingly vulnerable to identity crises, anxiety, and even depression. However, Jung also believed that there is a way out. But it does not lie in forcefully destroying perfectionism, nor in accepting mediocrity. The solution is something much deeper: to recognize, integrate, and transform the energy that is currently trapped in this destructive cycle. For what currently imprisons can, when brought to consciousness, become fuel for a much more authentic life. But how to break this cycle? How to use one's own imperfection as a path to freedom, rather than imprisonment? To answer this, we need to understand how Jung viewed the path to overcoming these patterns and how we can, in practice, begin to break free from this golden prison. This is what we will discuss in the next part. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. If there is something that differentiates Carl Gustav Jung from so many other thinkers in psychology, it is his radically transformative view of human suffering. For Jung, symptoms, anxiety, compulsions, blockages are not just problems to be eliminated, but messages from the unconscious. They are invitations, sometimes brutal, for the individual to discover something essential about themselves. In the case of perfectionism, the message is clear. There is an inner power that is being suffocated. There is an unlived life that demands to finally come to the surface. Jung did not see perfectionism as a moral flaw. He understood it as a legitimate psychic defense, created to protect the ego from confronting internal contents that still seem too great, too dangerous to be faced. But he also warned that if this defense crystallizes, it transforms into a prison. And the key to escaping this prison lies in the process he called individuation. Individuation, in Jungian thought, is the path by which the individual becomes what they are in essence. It is the process of integrating all parts of the psyche, including those that have been repressed, denied, or projected onto others. And here is the crucial point. For Jung, the goal is not to eliminate the shadow or to forcefully rid oneself of perfectionism. It is to integrate, to transform, to make the energies that were once blocked serve conscious life. In the case of the perfectionist, this means recognizing that the drive for excellence is not in itself something bad. The desire to do well can be an extraordinary force, capable of generating valuable works, bold projects, impressive achievements. The problem arises when this force becomes tyrannical, demanding absolute perfection and paralyzing action. The Jungian path, therefore, is not to destroy perfectionism, but to transform it from something rigid and paralyzing into something flexible and creative. Jung believed that this process begins with an act of courage, looking at the shadow, asking oneself, without masks, what am I avoiding by seeking perfection so much? For many, the answer is devastating. They are avoiding discovering what they are truly capable of. They are avoiding the responsibility of using their talent, their voice, their power. For shining requires paying the price of exposure, judgment, and, above all, commitment to one's own greatness. Another central aspect of Jungian thought is the importance of accepting imperfection as part of the creative process. Jung asserted that growth occurs in the territory of error, of trying, of learning. Those who wait to be perfect before acting never accomplish anything significant, because perfection is, by nature, unattainable. And it is precisely this impossibility that the perfectionist cannot bear to admit. There is a powerful excerpt from Jungian thought that encapsulates this idea. Freedom begins the moment you accept that your first attempt will be imperfect. Freedom is born when the individual accepts that the first draft will be imperfect, that the first video will not be brilliant, that the first attempt may fail, and that's okay. It is in this space of imperfection that true creativity resides. It is there that original ideas, innovations, and authentic works that carry the unique mark of the individual are found. But Jung did not limit himself to theoretical insights. He also pointed out practical ways to begin this transformation. One of them is dialogue with the shadow. Instead of repressing imperfect thoughts, the individual can write them down, reflect on them, and ask themselves what is true in each fear. Another way is to start small, to act even when the feeling of being ready does not exist, to do something today, even if it is imperfect. For paradoxically, it is in imperfect action that the psyche is liberated. The great truth is that no process of individuation is comfortable. It requires courage to admit that much of perfectionism is fear. It requires humility to accept one's own fallible humanity. But, according to Jung, only this path leads to an authentic life. And more than that, to a life full of meaning. However, knowing all this intellectually is not enough. It is necessary to bring these ideas into the concrete, into everyday life. How, in practice, can someone begin to break the cycle of perfectionism? How is this courage implemented in real life? This is exactly what we will explore in the next part, where we will see practical strategies to transform imperfection into fuel for action. After delving into the depths of the human psyche, perhaps the most important question remains for many. What do I do now? Because intellectually, understanding that perfectionism is a form of fear is not enough. Knowing that there is a latent power hidden beneath layers of demand and self-criticism is also insufficient. Action is required. It is necessary to bring into daily reality everything that Jung taught us about individuation, shadow, and integration. The truth is simple but painful. As long as someone is waiting for the perfect moment, the perfect idea, or the perfect execution, life will pass by. Perfectionism robs not only external opportunities, but also the chance to discover who you truly are. Jung said that suffering arises not from living a difficult life, but from living a life that is not ours. Perfectionism, in this sense, is an elegant trap that keeps many people stuck in small, safe, and deeply unsatisfying existences. So, how do we begin to break this cycle? Here are some concrete practices inspired by both Jungian psychology and modern applied psychology techniques. First, act before you are ready. The initial impulse should come from action, not thought. If you are writing a text, finish the draft, without worrying about whether it is perfect. If you have a project, launch it, even if it is not the final version. Jung believed that the self can only fully emerge when it is lived in the real world, not just contemplated in the mind. Second, set clear limits for preparation. Give yourself a short, almost uncomfortable deadline to plan. Then commit to acting. Because each additional day in the preparation phase feeds the illusion that you are still not good enough. Perfection is not in endless preparation, but in the courage to correct as you go. Third, start to dialogue with your shadow. When you feel fear, shame, or blockage, instead of fleeing, sit down and write. What am I really afraid of here? What is the worst that could happen if I do this imperfectly? Often, just naming the fear diminishes its power. Fourth, accept that the first version of anything will be imperfect, and that's okay. Jung said that psychic energy needs to flow. When we block it, it turns into anguish. It is better to produce something imperfect than to remain paralyzed. Fifth, develop small conscious victories against perfectionism. Choose something simple to do deliberately in a good enough way. It could be writing a text without obsessively revising, recording a video without repeating dozens of times, or simply allowing yourself to submit something that is 80% good. Each victory of this kind creates new neural connections that challenge the paralysis cycle. Finally, remember that imperfect action always outweighs perfect inaction. This is one of the greatest truths that Jung indirectly bequeathed to us. We are transformed not by thought, but by action. Perfectionism makes it seem like you are being careful, discerning, responsible. But often it is just fear dressed as virtue, and this fear, if not confronted, will steal years from your life, your talents, and the impact you could have on the world. Jung calls us to something much greater, to be whole, even in imperfection, because it is precisely in the vulnerability of real action that our true power resides. So here is the invitation. What are you postponing in the name of perfection? Share in the comments. Talk about the project you are waiting to finish, about the idea that is stuck on paper, or about the fear that paralyzes you. Shine a light on your shadow. You will realize that you are not alone. And if this video has brought deep reflections to you, continue watching the next video on the channel. It is also important because each piece of this knowledge forms the path to something greater, the liberation of your own greatness.